Okay, so I'm going to talk about plastic in the Great Lakes, and I want to thank Dina for, we were just joking about this, scheduling this way.
That's Corinne.
Because Corinne, okay. Because I enjoyed it. It was really cool hearing Nate talk about this, all of his work, but I want to say now I'm going to subtitle this, why everything you just heard in the last talk is terrible for the environment. So again, I'm Matt Hoffman, and I want to introduce myself quickly, because I work on a handful of things. So first of all, I'm an assistant professor here in the School of Mathematical Sciences. I think Dina was saying I'm at the moment in charge of the MS program in applied and computational math here. But as sort of a little bit of an interesting background, I was a postdoc in an Earth and Planetary Science department. My background, my PhD is in applied math and scientific computing, but I worked a lot in weather forecasting and data simulation. And again, what is data simulation? Let me just quickly give you an explanation. If you think about the weather forecasts that you see, if you want to know what the atmosphere is doing, you need a lot of information. The atmosphere is big, and so you get sensors all over the place, from weather balloons, from people that have weather stations, from aircraft in flight. And all of these need to be combined together, right, into some sort of cohesive map. And so if you look, this is actually from NOAA. And so this is basically an idea of the data that they get in any period, right? So you see a combination of satellite data. The yellow lines are airplanes flying throughout the globe. And so all of this data needs to be combined together into some concrete picture of what's happening. Right? You want to go from this, right, to this, right? And the way that works is some combination of data integration with these computationally intensive numerical models that simulate what's happening in the atmosphere. So this is a really neat problem, and actually has lots of applications to lots of things. As a PhD student, I worked on the Chesapeake Bay, right, and looking at satellite data, giving you sea surface temperatures in the Chesapeake, and how to combine these with computational models to get a better picture of what's happening. I did some work on the atmosphere of Mars with the satellites that are orbiting, also taking data. With all of these, the idea was, say for the Chesapeake, how do you get a better idea of what the currents look like, right? Now when I moved up here, one of these things that I started being interested in was, well, once we have those currents, right, what can we do with them? And so that's how I first got involved in plastic, right, and started thinking about plastic pollution, and I'm going to talk about that today. But I do some other things as well. I've also done data simulation on cardiac models. Interestingly enough, cardiac electrophysiology models have a lot of similarities to ocean models in that you can see the surface using cameras, but you can't see into the interior. Right? So the question is, how do you combine that information? I do some Air Force work tracking vehicles through complicated urban environments, where again you have a model of movement, and then you have images from some sort of sensor, multiple sensors. I'm also the director of analytics for RIT's hockey team. So I do hockey analytics and sports analytics. We had a student who was working on tennis analytics. So we have a paper in review right now looking at tracking data from the US Open and modeling the value of different situations and points. So one of these unifying themes is sort of applying data and models to interesting situations. If you think any of this sports stuff is cool, I'm going to do a quick pitch. Yearly, we've had a conference here at RIT. The next one's going to be September 14th of this year. The Sports Analytics Conference. It's one Saturday. And in the past, we've had interesting talks, more hockey than not, but we've had a bunch of other sports represented. We've had people that work for a lot of professional teams come and talk and hang out. So it's a neat thing. It's all day. There's some breakfast and lunch. It's $25 and then $5 for students. So if anyone who's interested in coming. Also, if you know anybody or you're interested, this year we're excited to have a data competition where we actually partnered with a tracking firm who's given us access to a bunch of games where they have the position of the puck and all of the different players for multiple games. So it's a cool data set, and we're excited to we're gonna have people submit some things and see what they can do with this data. So again, if you're interested in any of that stuff, let me know. But I'm gonna move on now and talk about plastic. So I think most of you, I suspect, have probably heard about plastic pollution, seen it certainly, but heard about it. It's become sort of a bigger deal recently. So plastic in general, right, production, use, and waste has increased dramatically since the introduction in the 50s. This is sort of a classic from Life magazine in 1955, right? Plastic is a wonderful material, right? It's durable, it's cheap to make, and initially it was amazing because you could do this and you can just throw out the plates and you don't have to worry about doing dishes. And so this is sort of the culture that sort of came about with plastic, single-use plastics and things like that. As you can see, the production of plastic has increased exponentially. Packaging is the largest source of plastic, and then this stuff enters the system. And plastic pollution is fairly ubiquitous. Again, I suspect all of you have seen plastic garbage around. Many of you have also probably heard about ocean garbage patches, which I think have gotten a lot of the press, right? So world's largest collection of garbage is twice the size of Texas. This is out in the middle of the Pacific. There's garbage patches in all of the major oceans. Plastic waste is making its way into the Arctic. I think this caption about sums it up, right? Plastic waste has been found everywhere that researchers have looked for it. That includes remote mountain lakes. It's in the soil. There have been some interesting studies of what kind of effects that has on the environment. Of course, if it's in the environment, it's making its way into wildlife, right? So this is, UK mussels contain plastic and other contaminants. A couple years ago, you might have seen this came out, plastic fibers found in tap water around the world. So this is a study done actually by someone at SUNY Fredonia. Interestingly, I remember talking to her at a conference, and she said, when we did this study, we thought, okay, cool, we found that plastic isn't drinking water, it's going to get people's attention, and we were really disheartened to hear quite often the response, okay, I need to drink bottled water. So they went back and did that, and you know what, it's in bottled water too. And while it seems like there might be an obvious solution to all of this, I hate to tell you, it's in beer as well. So beer brewed from the Great Lakes has plastic fibers in it as well. And so clearly, right, it's also in the air, right? And it's clearly we're getting into us somehow. If there is ever any doubt, it's found in human poop. Plastic has been found sort of everywhere that people look. And so it's certainly a problem from a scale factor. But I want to tell you quickly how I got interested in this. I told you that my background is in working with models of aquatic systems, right? And so when I first started hearing about this, and it was probably 2012 when I first started thinking about this, there were two main things that was interesting to me. One was this question about what about the Great Lakes, right? How much plastic is in the Great Lakes? And when the EPA at one point, when it was a thing, used to say that one of the issues they had with public awareness, again, this is more than 5 years ago, was that there were no bottom line numbers on the volume, right? Which is sort of an issue in making people understand how big the problem was. Now, in 2015, there were global ocean estimates that were published and got a lot of attention, but no Great Lakes number had existed. But when people started finding plastic in the Great Lakes, there was speculation that, and this is from 2013, right, from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, posed this question of, is there a garbage patch in the Great Lakes, right? And the idea was, if you look at average currents, in Lake Erie, they're circular. that sort of structure in the oceans tends to lead to accumulation in patches. And so, do you see accumulation in the Great Lakes? And these are the two things that I really started looking at. Because no one had done this on the Great Lakes. People had thought about the oceans a lot more. And as I said, plastic started really being generated in the 50s. As far back as the 70s, people were really seeing it in the global oceans. And so, I mean, this is from 1973, plastic in seabird stomachs. So this is in the literature years and years ago. And one of the things that's kind of interesting from a modeling perspective is it's not uniformly distributed, right? So these are samples from the Pacific from 1990, and you can see that the size of the circle is the amount that they find. Okay, so there's a clear, it's not uniform, right? So it's not just equally distributing, and so there's something that you can potentially model. In the oceans, people had always sort of assumed that things did go into the middle of the ocean, right? The general structure of ocean currents is fairly well understood. I mean, in 1870, in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Jules Verne writes about the Sargasso Sea in the Atlantic. The Nautilus goes through the Sargasso, and there's all sorts of debris everywhere, natural debris, right, in that case. But actually, in that book, he says, essentially, this is great. This is, the book says something like, this is God's way of ensuring that once we deplete all of the natural resources on land, there's some stored in the ocean for us to use. So that was how it was viewed at that point. But it was only 2013 was really when people started modeling this in the ocean. And so, or 2012, I guess. And so here's 3 different papers that came out that year. These are all computer models predicting where things that enter the ocean will end up. And notice they all have this same sort of garbage patch, right, in all of the major oceans. Interestingly, the methodologies for these are somewhat different. But one thing that is cool is, let's see, this paper and this paper, they actually use, there's actually a global drifter database, and this is actually something that's kind of, it's accessible, it's free data, and for science, people throw drifters in, and they measure where they go, and so you get this nice sort of parametric curve of where the currents are taking things. And that data is freely available, and so they basically took that data set and used that to figure out where things are going to be moving through the oceans. So again, this sort of agrees with what people thought. Quickly, from the why do we care and what plastic garbage is, people care about wildlife, and a lot of this stuff is large, whether it's nets that have broken free of moors or dropped off of boats and can ensnare animals. So this is a bird with cigarette lighters and bottle caps in its stomach. There have been a lot of pictures of turtles who eat plastic bags thinking that they're jellyfish or have straws stuck up their nose. And that is sort of the picture I think most of us have. I do want to point out that a lot of the garbage is actually small stuff, right? This sort of micro size, small beads, fibers, fragments, weirdly shaped fragments. And so this garbage patch the size of Texas is actually more like a large plastic soup, right? So if you actually were to go there, you're not going to see huge amounts of debris. It'll sort of all be beneath the surface. So this is, again, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about here. This is an estimate of waste generation, and you can see it pretty much mirrors the production plot I showed you earlier, with the exception of the packaging component is larger. So construction is actually the second largest production of plastic, but because that lasts a long time, packaging, which normally just is used once, is about half of the waste generation. And if you look at estimates globally, only about 9% of this is recycled. So of all of this is 8,300 million tons of plastic, which has been produced since 1950. You can see most of it has been discarded or incinerated. One of the interesting things from a modeling perspective is that plastic is not one thing, right? Different shapes, different types, different sources, and that makes it a sort of challenging problem to get a handle on, is that you have all of these different types of debris coming from different locations, and so figuring out where it goes and what impact it has is pretty challenging. As I said, plastic was found in the Great Lakes in 2013. Many of you probably heard about this. It generated a lot of attention. A lot of the focus was on these spherical microbeads, and that led to a national ban on microbeads, which was like the only thing that passed in the 2015 Congress. That unanimously banned microbeads, which is sort of unheard of for that. Anyway, so basically, one of the things is not just that plastic was found, but that the concentrations were similar to things that were seen in the ocean. I already said that this led to speculation about garbage patches, but further studies have found it in the rivers, in the sediment, and sort of everywhere that people have looked around the Great Lakes. On the beaches, anywhere from 77 to 90% of what's found in beach cleanups is plastic debris. To look at Lake Ontario in particular, this is some data that I pulled from New York beach cleanups. This is from Chelsea Rockman at the University of Toronto. But you can see these are the most common items that are found in public beach cleanups and entered into a database. And you can see most of these items are plastic items that people are finding. So again, this is to say, this is the problem I'm talking about. This is what plastic sort of looks like. And then the next question is, what do I and what does math have to do with this? Right? I'm an applied mathematician, really interested in mathematical modeling, and modeling here is really important because sampling is hard, right? This is from a paper where they're actually showing the process. So you pull it out of the water, and then you have to wash it. You have to try to get rid of all the all the organic material, right? And then you have to sieve it to separate it by sizes, and then you have to put it under a microscope, and have a student put it under a microscope and count it by hand. And then if you want to know what it is, you need to put it through like a Raman microscope or something else to figure out what polymer it is. So this is a time-consuming process, and you just can't take that many observations. Whereas with a model, you can actually, if you can simulate things reasonably well, you can get an idea of where things are over an entire basin. You can also try to answer questions about what happens if you have new policy implementations, what the effects will be. You could advise cleanup efforts by sort of saying where problems might be biggest, or assess the risk for wildlife. This is from a paper that looked at seabird ingestions. Basically used a model to predict where you're going to get large concentrations of plastic, combine that with models of where seabirds are migrating, right? And is using that to then estimate what the risk is for seabirds around the world. Okay, so you can do things like this. So this is how I started along this process of trying to develop a model for the Great Lakes to understand where the plastic is going. So when constructing a model, right, the question is, what are the processes that you want to deal with? This is a schematic I made of sort of the different processes that govern transport of plastic in a lake. And so again, when doing mathematical modeling, right, the first question you need to ask is, well, where do I start, right? And so the easiest thing here is, well, let's just take a look at transport. People are finding this stuff on the surface, right? So let's just see how it moves around the surface, how it enters, how it moves around the surface, and then how it leaves. Okay. And so this, a couple years ago, we did this, and basically, one of the neat things about this is there's a lot of data to deal with, but model-wise, it's fairly simple, right? So you can get maps of currents, and actually, maybe I'll point out quickly that NOAA, actually the Great Lakes Division, has maps of currents. So these come from their hydrodynamic models, and so this is a visualization on their website of current patterns, right? And so the simplest model for motion is just, well, the right? The derivative of position is just going to be velocity. And so here's my velocities, right? And so you can move this, you can move things around. So I run the large hydrodynamic models myself, but you can actually download any of this current data from NOAA's website. So this is all available data. And then, so our model here is just the simple, dx dt is u, dy dt is v. And again, we're solving this using a Runge-Kutta method in MATLAB, but you could easily, look at pathways using an Euler method, something simple like that, just to sort of see what's happening. And when you do that, you get something that looks like this. Now again, this is assuming that you've got particles that are coming in from the shore. We looked at census data to figure out what the largest populations are, because they're going to be the largest waste generators. It's sort of fun to watch. And one of the things that you notice, obviously the Cleveland area is the largest population center on Lake Erie. So there are a lot of things that are leaving there, things coming out of the river from Detroit. But you see the overall pathway as it moves through the system. And one thing you do notice when you look at this is occasionally you see events where you get sort of spiraling and accumulation. But overall, even though you do see sometimes where there's sort of this patchiness, you then see winds sort of move quickly through the system and wipe it out of the middle. Right? So one of the first things that we notice when doing this is this image does not show any indication of a garbage patch. Right? So this was sort of one of the first questions that we were looking at. Is there a garbage patch? And the indication is no. If you go and look at what happens over 6 years, so this is 6 years of an average, right? And you compare that to what you saw in the ocean. There's no evidence for a garbage patch here, right? And this is one of those things that, so this is one of the first things. It doesn't seem to be a garbage patch in the Great Lakes. You do see some interesting transport, right? And so what this is showing is blue is where there's a net export of debris, and red is where there's a net import, right? So you see some interesting, from a policy perspective, transport from Chicago to Michigan, right? So this is an interstate issue, right? Transport from Toronto to the shores of the US on Lake Ontario, well, this is now an international issue. And so if you want to worry about how to regulate this or how to curb it, there needs to be coordination between governments, right? That's an interesting thing to realize. The other thing about the garbage patch question is initially it's like, cool, no garbage patch, that's great. But then if it's not in the middle of the lake, where is it? Probably on the shore or at the bottom. So maybe actually that's worse. Out of curiosity, just for comparison, this is how our model compares to some of the samples that were taken. So if you see the circles in blue are the data that was taken that we compared to. The red is the model, and I think in general things compare pretty well. The worst fit is this area where they found 500,000 particles in their samples, and our predictions are a little bit low here. This is comparison to some beach data, right? Just getting a look at the relative distributions everywhere. So we're pretty happy with this fit. And so using that, we can then go through and we can try to ask this question about what do the estimates look like for how much is there. So I mentioned that there was a global estimate paper. And so this methodology involves the following assumptions. It's sort of interesting to hear. Each US resident produces a little over 2.5 kilograms per day of garbage. That's this waste of all types. About 13% of that's plastic. And there's this assumption in the model that 2% is mismanaged in the US. This is littered, right? Our waste streams are pretty good. So most of this is just sort of lost through littering, intentionally or unintentionally. And so you get a number for what percentage of this is mismanaged plastic. And then the assumption is in coastal areas, about 30% of that is going to enter the water. And when you run those numbers, you get around 10,000 tons, which is 22 million pounds of plastic, which would be predicted to enter the Great Lakes every year. And you can see the distribution by individual lakes. Now, that's sort of a top-down estimate. You can try to go bottom-up, which is if you take a look at the comparison of the model to data, right, you can get essentially just a multiplicative conversion between what the model's seeing and what that translates to in real life, right? And when you do that, you get an estimate of around, well, in Lake Erie, for example, almost 4.5 tons floating in the lake. And again, it's important to mention that that 4.5 tons is microplastic, right? Plastic that's 5 millimeters or smaller in size. So, I don't know whether that sounds like a lot or not to you, but one thing that you do notice is that the estimates in the Erie were like 2,500 tons a year. The estimates of floating plastic is like 4. So you have this several order of magnitude difference between what's predicted to be entering on a yearly basis and what's predicted to be floating. The same thing's been found when people have done this on the global oceans. So one of the big questions that people are trying to answer right now is what happens to this missing mass. So this is something we wrote recently about trying to answer this question of where the rest of the plastic goes, because right now it's not showing up in our models. And I'm going to take a quick moment to just acknowledge a couple people, because we're trying to build sort of a bigger group studying this at RIT. So Eric Hittinger's in public policy, and he and I wrote this paper a couple years ago. So he's helped a lot with estimating what's coming in. Juliet's one of our PhD students in mathematical modeling, who's been working on vertical transport. Christy Tyler is in life sciences, and so Christy and Nathan is in chemistry. We've been working over the summer to try to look at, well, Nathan studies atmospheric chemistry, so look at what's actually going in from the air, right? And then Christy studies benthic ecology, so then how things are moving vertically in the system, and what happens when it gets to the bottom of the lake. She has a student who's running some cool experiments this summer looking at worms and how worms actually grab particles and move them through the system, right? They actually bury them. So this is an effect that we're trying to measure in the lab, and then find a way to put into a mathematical model to better understand how things are moving around. So we can start to take a look at some of these other processes. So the first thing would just be to say, well, now let's look at vertical motion. Let's just assume everything moves with the currents, right? So there's no density differences or anything like that. Things just move with currents. And when you do that, you get something like this. And one of the things you notice here, if this will run, in this simulation, it's basically the same as the one I showed you before, except the color of the particle here represents depth. So the darker blue it is, the deeper it is in the water. And so again, things are just moving in the vertical direction because of currents, but you already see that a bunch of things are ending up deep in the water column, right? I like this animation because you can really see the effect of, you can see currents at different levels, right? You see how the stuff at the bottom is moving differently than the stuff at the surface. So I think it's kind of fun to look at. But you do notice that actually a lot of things here are actually ending up deep in the water column. And again, that's just assuming that everything is neutral density and moves with currents, right? So it's just adding a, right, dz dt is w, right? Solving these things the same way. So I mentioned Juliet, who's a PhD student. She did some work this past semester trying to look at what happens with mixing to actually try to take into account the fact that different plastics have different densities, and trying to look at actually keeping track of what hits the bottom to try to think about what's going to end up on the bottom. And so her model was basically the same horizontally, and then the vertical piece was broken up into 2 sections, right? One is the advective section, which is what I showed before, right? Just velocity effect, but then also a diffusion effect. And so in this case, basically looking at a combination. So this WB here is the sinking velocity of the plastic, right? So this will be different for different polymers. And then this piece at the end here is taking into account the mixing, right? Turbulent mixing of the water. So you can look at the turbulence diffusion in the model, and then there's some random numbers in here which just account for motion that's missed, right, by just moving with the currents. And so we looked at 9 different polymers. These are some of the most common, about 75% of the most common polymers, and put them into the model. Again, you need sinking velocities for every polymer, so we can find those in the literature. And then when you do that, we run them on a desktop, and this is sort of a vertical picture of what we're seeing when you combine all of these different polymers. And this is vertically, right? Each one of these bars is 1/10 of the water column, and so you can see the vertical distribution there as well. And so this is now, right, a slightly different vertical distribution picture. You can see, for example, right, that on the surface, by far you're seeing the most expanded polystyrene, which is foam, right? This is light. Polyethylene and polypropylene also floats. The rest of these sink, so you can see far less of them on the surface, right? And then you can look at what's on the beach and in the bottom. So this would be an estimate of what is on the bottom of the lake, and this is what's estimated on the beach. This is data that was published a couple years ago, looking at in the bottom of the lake several places around Canada and on several beaches. So one thing you can see is that there's some similarities here, again, qualitatively in the shape of these. And so you can take a look at the distribution of the different polymers. And this is important for understanding effects. One thing here is that about half of the particles stay at the surface, half end up on the bottom in these models. And that's sort of true regardless of how long you run them for. And this is actually a model limitation, because in practice, right, you see there's a lot of expanded polystyrene, right, this styrofoam on the surface, but actually if you go and look, you find it on the bottom a lot, because as things are in the water, a lot of stuff accumulates on them, right? It changes the density and it causes things that float to sink. So this is unpublished. This is something that we're just sort of playing around with, of what happens if you add this change in density the longer it's been in the water. Now, when people have looked at this, and there's not a lot of studies on this, what you see is sort of algal growth, other sort of biological stuff ends up on the particle. It gets heavier, it starts to sink, and then when it goes down for a while, it's away from the light, so some of that dies off, and it gets lighter again, right? And it moves back up into the close to the surface. So there's not a good understanding of how this works. So we said, well, what happens if you just say, let's fit a sinusoid to this, right? Okay, so let's just say, well, it takes about 30 days to sink, and then after that, it'll just move up and down in the water column, right? So we just fit a function, right? Fit a trig function to this, and said, well, let's see, when you then plug that additional motion in to everything else, how does that change the distribution? And so we played around with a couple different signs, right? So this is when you have no change in density. Here you have effects where that sinusoidal motion goes down 5 meters. Here's where it goes down 10 meters. Here's 30 meters. So we're just changing the amplitude of the oscillation. And you can see the cumulative effect it has on the vertical distribution in the model of where you're seeing things, right? You go from seeing everything at the surface, basically, to shifting the peak down, right, to the top 10%, 20% of the water column, and moving a lot more debris down farther through the system, right? So again, this hasn't really been modeled at all in any of the global models, but it gives you an idea of the effect, right, that you can see in this, and what potential impact it has. And it also impacts deposition, right? You go from having, say, 40,000 particles deposited onto the sediment to 85,000 when you have it sink far before coming back up, right? So this can have a big effect. So this is stuff that we're still working on. One of the fun things for me is it's very interdisciplinary, and so I have to work with a lot of people doing these experiments to try to understand what the effects are before we can model them. And so, in particular, better estimates of how things are breaking down, and also better estimates of how things are entering the system, right, is going to be really important since a lot of stuff sinks. So this is sort of again, this is how I'm using some of these methods to look at this problem in the Great Lakes, and then all of these methods, right? All of this would apply to the global problem as well. So Dina, I have like I've got time. Right?
Yeah.
So let me also give you let me talk about a couple other quick things while I have a few minutes. I showed these videos where you have particles moving around, right? But there's some other interesting things you can do with this. So one thing you can do is you notice from those videos that actually there's some interesting shapes that happen, right? It's sort of fun to watch because everything doesn't mix uniformly, right? Things congregate some places, there's blank areas. And so from a dynamics perspective, these would sort of be barriers to flow, barriers to transport. Again, if you're in the dynamical system, college dynamical systems literature, you're talking about like manifolds and things like that. But you don't need to talk about that language, and you can estimate this stuff using some simple metrics. So one way that we've played around with briefly is so these things are called Lagrangian coherent structures, and you can think of this as just some line that either things are going to move towards or move away from. And you can measure this, right? This is called an M function, but you look at the formula, this is just an arc length integral, right? So, and the idea behind this is simple. Take two particles. If there is a line that things are attracted to, well, they'll move towards it, right? And they'll move away. And if you've got two things on the same side of something that are in a part of the flow that's all doing the same thing, they're going to travel the same distance, right? Now, if you have things on opposite sides of some division in the flow, they're going to travel different distances. And so if you calculate with a bunch of particles the distance each particle travels, and you look at areas where you have sharp changes, that'll identify an area in the flow where there's a significant change in dynamical behavior, right? Just to show you what I mean, this is actually, there was an article on this on the New York Times several years ago, and I like this figure. The idea is you're trying to find this white line, right? This is the Lagrangian coherent structure, and particles on one side will stay on that side, right? Particles on the other will stay on the other side. So it serves as a barrier to transport. The shape changes over time, right? But what you'll notice is particles on either side don't cross over, right? And so you get very different behavior there. So the models I showed you with particles moving around the lake, you can actually compute the distance traveled for each of those, right? And if you plot it on a map, it looks something like this, right? So this is Lake Erie. Color here represents distance traveled of a particle that started in that location, right? Okay. So, right, a particle that started here and here, they both traveled about the same distance, right? Because they're the same color. Whereas something here and something here travel different distances. And so what you look at on this picture are sharp gradients, right? We have abrupt changes from one color to another, right? And that's where there's some dynamic, right, some property of the flow which is preventing things from crossing and leading to accumulation or trapping potentially. So this is potentially interesting because you can see these shapes show up. So this is something we created around in 2011, right? And so this is a satellite image from that same year, right? Showing algal blooms, right? So this is a microcystis bloom in Lake Erie during that same time. And so one question that comes about with this sort of algal bloom is we're still trying to understand how they work, right? And you can have a spread algae from one area to another by two main methods, right? Either it's just going with the flow, or it is sort of growing, right? And it's expanding through growth. Right? So you can have either of those effects. And so one thing you'll notice is if you actually compare these two, right? You see some shapes, right? Here, and I think here you can see some of these shapes captured between the two of these. And so this was a event, a really big algal bloom, and one of the theories as to how this happened is that you did have this dynamic trapping. You had sort of a barrier that prevented water in this part of Lake Erie from moving out, right, and kept it there, and that allowed the bloom to grow before it eventually spread out. Okay, so we've been doing some work trying to, again, just using arc length computations, right, to make these pictures and then try to understand where you get some of these barriers and whether they persist and whether that's a factor in having growth of algal blooms. Okay. And I like this just because, again, it's neat to look at, it's neat to compare with data, and the computation behind it is a fairly simple calculus computation. And let me just quickly go through one more thing that I've worked on that I think is a neat example. And it's related to this idea of lakes, water, and how to deal with the environmental impacts and understand things. And this is something that, actually I guess the story behind this is a project that started in the Russian Arctic. So this is a train in Russia after 30 hours. It's 3 in the morning. And so this is getting off this train. We then took an 1.5-hour boat ride to a biological station in the Arctic. So I met some Russian fisheries biologists. And one of the things that they're worried about in the Great Lakes, but also in here, is how do you keep track of fish populations, right? How do you understand what's in the water? And a lot of the time they do that using what are called gill nets. Now, these are a problem from a marine debris perspective, because if they break off these lines, they drift and they kill things. But if they're done properly, you're only killing the fish that you are expecting to kill, and not random things. And so they use these to samples, right? You put it in for some length of time, you see how many fish you get, and then the question is, you've got this small sample of water, how do you figure out how many fish you have in the entire system, right? And a lot of the way that this has been done is basically assume there's some statistical distribution and fit a statistical model to that, right, to the data that you get. And so I met some people, someone in particular, who was actually trying to look at this a different way, and it was cool from a modeling perspective because it was really mechanistically looking at, well, let's look at all of the processes that lead to a fish being captured by a net, right? So let's look at all the fish you have, and you can get captured in 2 ways. You can either get captured by going through a hole, or you can actually get a tooth stuck in the net, right? So these 2 methods to capture. And then the question is, what are the probability of each of these? If you're going to get wedged in the net, well, you first have to encounter an opening, and then you have to enter, and then you have to get wedged, right? And so each of those has their own associated probabilities, and then how do you put them together to get this likelihood of being captured? And so if you look at each of these individual probabilities, again, there's actually a lot of fairly simple mathematics in them. For example, well, we'll take a look. You've got a fish that's encountering one of these diagonal shapes, right, the diagonal holes. The net's pretty taut, so then what's the probability that it's going to enter? What's the probability it's going to hit a wire, right? Well, you need to calculate the area inside this diamond, right, that's the fish body length away from the end, right? And so this just becomes a trig problem, right, where now you're trying to compute the areas of this inner diamond, right, versus the total area of the entire diamond. And so you're looking at the geometry there of that. Also, fish aren't necessarily going to hit head on. They can hit from different angles. and depending on the angle, you'll have a different likelihood of capture, right? And so then you're modeling the angle that fish are likely to hit, and then what's the probability given their body shape that they're going to then fit through the hole, right? So each of these is a little, right, its own little thing, where you're using mostly trig to get a sense of what the likelihood each of these things is doing, and then combining them together to get some overall estimate of what the likelihood is of capture, right? So I like this example because it's sort of related in the environmental side, but it is this example of a lot of different, I would say sort of what I would say simple math, high school math, right? That you're just combining to model some problem that people are interested in. So we published this work last year and are now working on ways to then use these estimates to get this sort of global estimate of what's in a particular body of water. And I think those are the couple things that I wanted to talk about. So I'm happy to take questions.
Any questions for Matt? At all?
Yeah.
It looked like you focused on Lake Erie.
Yeah.
How come that lake?
Yeah. Good question. A couple of reasons. So one is Lake Erie is, reputation-wise, Lake Erie people always talk about as being one of the most polluted, and so it's one that's received a lot of attention. It's also smaller and the geometry is a little bit more regular, and so from that perspective, it's sort of more computationally efficient to model. The other thing about Lake Erie is, if you look at it's got the smallest residence time of any of the Great Lakes. So what that means is, residence time is the sort of average amount of time that some parcel of water stays in a lake. So I don't know if you've ever heard, right? There's a saying for Lake Superior that Lake Superior never gives up its dead. Have you guys heard this? Yeah, so that's because the residence time in Lake Superior is like 190 years. So on average, water stays in there, and dead bodies, right, stay in there for a really, really long time. Lake Michigan, the residence time is like 90 years. I'm gonna say Lake Huron, it's in the 10s. Lake Ontario is about 7, and Lake Erie is about 3.